Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Caneel Joyce. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Management here. My work is on creativity, design, and innovation, and I am an absolute technophile nerd, so I've been tracking Stephen Johnson for many years. He's given me advice through his blog on how to organize my ideas, how to find connections between things that seem totally unrelated, and basically how to integrate knowledge across all sorts of domains. I don't purport to be an expert in these things, but Stephen certainly is. Tonight he's going to be talking about his new book, one of seven books. This one is called Where Good Ideas Come From, The Natural History of Innovation. It's an absolutely fascinating read. You definitely want your own copy so that you can mark it up and refer back to it. It weaves together history, technology, science, evolution, psychology, and the mind, and other things as well. So really encourage you to pick it up. Stephen lives in Brooklyn currently with his wife and 3 sons. He's founded 3 important websites: Feed, Plastic.com, and Outside In, which was his most recent venture. He's here tonight at the end of a long book tour. So we're excited to hear what I hear will be some new material for Stephen. He's shaking it up a bit for us. And he'll be talking tonight for about 30 minutes. After that, we will have question and answer from you. So please do collect your questions as they go, and we'll have a few mics being passed around. After the talk, Stephen will be signing copies of his book, and I'm sure if you brought any of his others, Mind Wide Open, Interface Culture, The Invention of Air, Everything Bad is Good for You, any of those he will probably be happy to sign as well. So without further ado, here's Stephen.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, this is the last official event of the Good Ideas World Tour. World Tour only because I came to London at the end of the US tour. So thank you for that. So I can say World Tour. I'm slightly losing my voice, which is what happens on book tour. I think I've done 28 events in the last 26 days or something like that. And so as Caneel said, I want to mix it up a little bit, and I'm not going to talk about the book at all. I'm just going to show you slides of my children, if that's all right for the next time. They're very cute. It'll be wonderful. We're going to have a great time. Now, but I actually did want to do something kind of different just to celebrate this end of this part of the promoting of the book, which is, in a sense, to kind of talk around the book. Talk a little bit about what brought me to this topic, how I came to write it, talk briefly about it, and then talk a little bit of things that have happened since it's come out now. It's been out for about a month, and it's one of the wonderful things that a book can do is really start conversations. The book continues to be the best mechanism for that, and one of the things I'm excited about is that this book seems to be doing that very nicely. So I'm going to give you a sense of what the book is about, but I'm actually going to do a bunch of kind of new things here. The roots of this book actually date back to my 2005 book, The Ghost Map, which is a historical story, true story, set here in London, not very far away from here. And The Ghost Map is the story of the famous cholera outbreak in London in the 1850s. And it was one of those situations where I had come to this story from multiple angles. I kept kind of approaching it from these various different kind of interpretive systems or different fields. I would kind of stumble across it in an information design context, or in a kind of history of science context, or a history of public health context. And it's a very famous story, but because I kept running into it from these different directions, I started to think that maybe there was a good book here. And the story, as I heard it, went something like this. There was a terrible outbreak in 1854 of cholera, this disease that was the great scourge of metropolitan centers around the world, really. And the authorities at the time were baffled as to the nature of this disease, what was causing it, and they all believed that, effectively, the cholera was in the air. This was the miasma theory of cholera. And a terrible outbreak comes to Soho in London in the late summer of 1854. 10% of the population of the neighborhood dies within about 10 days. But in the middle of this terrible fear and carnage, kind of a lone genius, brilliant physician named John Snow, who was a resident of the neighborhood, kind of boldly goes into the belly of the beast of this outbreak, starts knocking on doors to investigate who had died and who hadn't, and who, where they lived and all that stuff. And he builds a map. And the map basically pinpoints all the deaths in the neighborhood. And when you look at all those deaths organized spatially, they point like a kind of a flashing arrow to this popular pump, this watering hole at 40 Broad Street in the middle of the neighborhood. And when he looks at this map, Snow thinks to himself, aha, the water is the problem. It's not an airborne disease, it's a waterborne disease. And if you could clean the water supply, you could rid cities of this terrible, terrible plague. And so he goes to the authorities, they remove the handle of the pump, he convinces the kind of medical experts of the time of the efficacy of his theory, and the London sewers are built, the water supply is clean, cities all around the world follow, and the world has changed greatly for the better from this new understanding of the waterborne nature of cholera. So I thought, this is a fantastic story. It's like a Victorian episode of CSI. People are going to love it. It's got a page-turner kind of quality to it. So I decided to write a book on it, and I sat down and began to research it. And what I found when I researched the story is that just about every important fact that I just told you is untrue. That in fact, starting with the fact that Snow had the idea for the waterborne theory for 6 years before he made the map. That the map was not a sudden eureka moment when he suddenly looked down and understood everything. He'd in fact been working on this hunch that, in fact, cholera was in the water for an extremely long time. He'd written a number of papers, a number of letters to the Lancet, and actually made some other maps, and had failed to convince anyone of his idea. The map of the Broad Street outbreak turned out to be ultimately kind of a marketing vehicle for his idea. It wasn't actually the kind of source of the inspiration in the first place. And Snow himself turned out to be a very interesting figure the diversity of his interests turned out to be central to his ability to kind of solve this riddle. He was approaching the problem of cholera from a number of different angles. Cholera, in fact, was a hobby of his. Most of us don't have cholera as a hobby. And if you do, and you tell people about it at a cocktail party, it tends to alarm them. But for Snow, this was something he was doing on the side. He was a physician and an anesthesiologist. And it was in part because of his kind of different background and because he had these different interests that he was able to kind of see around the kind of blind spots of the kind of dominant regime in science at the time. But the most important thing that I found in this research is that Snow had a collaborator that almost no one talked about in telling this story. And his collaborator was a guy named the Reverend Henry Whitehead, who was kind of a local vicar. He was 25 years old. He was a kind of local vicar that would hang around in the pub with everyone in the neighborhood till late in the night. He knew everyone. He was not at all a man of science. He had no scientific training whatsoever, but he was a classic kind of social connector. He had great social intelligence, and he knew everyone. And when he ended up kind of partnering with Snow, it was Whitehead who was able to actually track down a lot of the cases and track down and kind of build the data set that ended up fueling the images on the map. And it was Whitehead who tracked down the patient 0, who had kind of been the original index case that had started the outbreak in the first place, which ended up being crucial in convincing the authorities that Snow's theory was right. And so here we had this kind of image of this classic eureka moment. Lone genius comes up with an idea that changes the world in an instant. And in fact, the story was much more nuanced. The idea was much slower in its incubation. And the process of kind of turning that idea into something that really changed the world was actually much more collaborative, much more of a network affair. And I think much more interesting because of it, right? And so I started to think, as I was writing the book, that there was this kind of latent theory about innovation that was kind of lurking in the background, about innovation and the spaces that lead to breakthrough ideas. And so I decided that I would kind of take that latent theory and put it in the foreground and write a book about great ideas and the environments that make them possible. And so I went to my publisher, and they said, that sounds like a wonderful idea. And so they bought the proposal, as did my wonderful publishers here in the UK, Alan Lane, some of whom are here. Thank you very much. And then quickly after that, I started to think, I think it would be interesting also to look at biological environments. that are unusually innovative. So not just human environments, not just social environments, but also natural ecosystems that have a long track record of biodiversity, of creating innovative new forms of life and supporting them. Things like coral reefs and tropical rainforests, because I suspected there would be these kind of interesting patterns that you would see both in nature and in culture that would shed light kind of on each other. And then I realized that I had, in setting the potential scope for this book, in terms of the number of things that I could actually include as stories and as data points in this study, was effectively infinite, right? This was a book that could include any good idea that any human being had ever had in the course of human history, plus any interesting life form that had ever evolved in the course of life on Earth, which is kind of a daunting thing when you're sitting down with your cup of coffee and, logging onto Google first thing in the morning. You're like, where do I start? And so for a while I was a little bit taunted and maybe a little bit feeling like I'd made a terrible mistake. And I procrastinated by starting a company outside in the middle of that, which bought me a year. And then finally I started, the way I got into the project was I started to research the history of ecosystem science. Because I thought ultimately I'm talking about idea ecosystems and thinking about the way that ideas flow through society is somewhat like the way that information, that energy flows through an ecosystem. And so I thought maybe there's an interesting story from the history of ecosystem science that I could kind of start with. And so I began to research that, and I stumbled across the story about Joseph Priestley, the brilliant kind of polymath, chemist, radical, political, religious thinker from the late 18th century. And Priestley is most famous for isolating oxygen for the first time, though in fact he turns out to be not the first person to do it. And when he did isolate oxygen, he gave it the name deflostigated air, which turned out to be not a very good brand for oxygen. It didn't really take off, and it was Lavoisier's name of oxygen that became the term. But what I found was that actually Priestley had discovered something else, which was, in fact, maybe even more impressive, and which he was, in fact, the first person to do, which was that Priestley was the first person to realize that plants were creating oxygen. And that the whole reason we have an atmosphere to breathe is because it's manufactured by the plants every second of every day as kind of a waste product of photosynthesis. And so I thought, okay, this is one of the founding ideas of kind of our understanding of kind of global environments and the whole idea of an atmosphere that we breathe being bound up in a connection with these plants. So I thought that'll be a great story. And so I began to research that, and it turned out that Priestley had a collaborator as well on that experiment that no one ever talked about, and that collaborator's name was Benjamin Franklin. And in fact, it was Franklin who suggested to Priestley the kind of global implications of what he had discovered. And so I got more and more interested in this, and it turned out that Priestley had all these connections to other American founding fathers, and so eventually I realized that I had to write a book about Priestley as well, and that became my book, Invention of Air, which necessitated me calling up my publishers and having the somewhat awkward conversation where you say, I know you've paid for this big book about innovation. I think a book about 18th century chemistry would be better right first, and then we'll do the innovation book, which, you're like, hello? Are you still there? But it ended up working out well because those two books really I now see as kind of preambles, and in a sense this is a bit of an informal trilogy where there are two kind of long format case studies about innovation and world-changing ideas and the environments that made them possible, and then this book at the center. What I found in going through all these different stories and the many other stories that I tell in the book, what I found is that there are these overarching patterns that show up. And they do recur in many of these cases again and again and again. And so the book is actually organized around these kind of 7 chapters, each of which kind of ruminates on and tells stories about one of the patterns. In those patterns, there are a number of kind of common themes. One of which is this idea that the importance of hunches, right, and slow hunches, as in the case of Snow or in the case of Priestley. Ideas do not come to us in terms of, in these sudden moments of clarity and inspiration and eureka moments. They almost never form that way. They almost always take long periods of time where the idea kind of lingers in the back of your mind and has to kind of be incubated, sometimes for decades. It doesn't make sense when you first kind of stumble across it. It's just this fragment of something. But then 5 years later, 10 years later, or sometimes just 5 months later, it turns into something more powerful. Often, it turns into something more powerful because you collide with someone else and someone else's hunch. there's some other kind of missing piece of the puzzle, some new perspective that opens up for you because you have a conversation with a Benjamin Franklin or a Henry Whitehead. And that in a sense, ideas are not these single things. They're much more like networks. They're much more like kind of implicit and elaborate collaborations that happen between people in environments where they're exposed to difference and to diversity. One of the big themes of the book is this idea that diversity is not just a political principle. There's a wonderful study a number of years ago by a Stanford Business School professor named Martin Roif, who looked at the social networks of unusually innovative people in the corporate world. And he was looking at their kind of, not their Facebook and Twitter accounts, but their actual social people they actually knew, right? And he basically had a control. He had, unusually innovative people in the corporate world and entrepreneurs, and then people who, to put it nicely, were less innovative in their lives. Which is, if you get asked to be part of the experiment, is the side you don't want to be invited to. You seem very dull. Is it all right if I interview you for a while? And what Roy found was that there was this kind of distinct kind of network pattern in the people that they knew and that they hung out with, which was that innovative people were friends with and had weak tie acquaintances with an unusually diverse range of professions. So you yourself were a marketing person at an ad agency, but you were friends with an architect, and you were friends with a plumber, and you were friends with a government contract lawyer and a popular science writer. Whereas the less innovative group were just friends with other people at other ad agencies. And you can see this makes a lot of sense when you look at it in the kind of broader context of the book, because so many of the ideas that I kind of profile are cases where somebody has taken some kind of interesting technology or some interesting concept or even just kind of a metaphor from one field and kind of ported it over and brought it over and kind of made new use of it in a surprising new way. And so in a sense, when you look at the problem of innovation from the perspective of this kind of borrowing and remixing of other people's ideas, one of the things that becomes clear is that diversity is not just a kind of a social good. It's not just something we want in our society because it makes us more tolerant and get along better, although that is certainly true. But on some level, being around kind of difference and different experiences and different kind of fields of expertise actually makes us smarter. It makes us more original in our thinking, more capable of approaching problems from new angles. And so one of the key principles here is that you want to put yourself in environments where your ideas are free to connect with other ideas, and where you're not kind of spending all of your energy trying to protect them and keep them kind of guarded and locked away so that no one steals them. And in fact, there's this long history of open intellectual environments where people are sharing their ideas, improving them, crossing disciplinary boundaries, many of which I've written about in Invention of Air. I mean, the whole amateur scientist scene that Priestley was a part of and that Franklin was a part of, and indeed the entire Enlightenment for the most part, was driven by people who were just exploring this new realm of kind of empirical science for the love of it, and were very keen on sharing their ideas as widely as possible. Now, after that period, an amazing, crucial institution developed, which we're in the middle of right now, which is the university system, the kind of modern research university, which, while it does have many commercial elements, is for the most part an open information commons where ideas are freely shared and people are able to build on other people's ideas and borrow them and remix them as long as they give kind of proper credit. People do not have direct ownership of their ideas the way that they might in a private sector environment, in a commercial environment. So we have these platforms, and of course the most powerful one, the most open, connective, innovative platform of our time is the internet and the World Wide Web. The web has innovated faster than any communications platform in history, precisely because it is set up as a platform that nobody owns, where you don't have to ask for permission to build something new on it. The web itself was built on top of the open platform of the internet. If Tim Berners-Lee had to ask for permission to build his new layer there, or if he'd had to do a complex business development deal to get permission to come up with the structure of the web, or if he hadn't been able to borrow some existing standards that he used in creating the original HTML standard, he probably would have never done it. But it was precisely because the net was an open environment that enabled somebody else to come along and build another kind of open environment on top of it, that we've had this tremendous kind of race towards an amazing diversification of the medium in just 15 short years. Now, I tell a lot of stories in the book, but one of the things I was worried about was the risk of arguing by anecdote. It's a wonderful kind of rhetorical device to use where you tell a bunch of different stories. It pulls people in. It helps make theoretical ideas more tangible. But even if you marshal 30 or 40 stories over the course of a 250-page book, somebody is going to say, yeah, well, I've got 30, 40 stories that make the other argument. And you've cherry-picked your examples here. So in the last chapter, one of the things that I tried to do is to kind of zoom out even further and look at the broad patterns of innovation over kind of the last 400 or 500 years. And I kind of charted about 300 different innovations in science and technology and commerce, and tried to kind of broadly categorize them as coming from either kind of individual entrepreneurs working alone for the kind of financial reward, corporations competing and collaborating with other corporations for financial reward, solo amateur scientists exploring things basically on their own for the love of it, and then this fourth quadrant, which is basically kind of, you can think of as the internet of the open source quadrant or the university quadrant, where people are sharing ideas collaboratively, building ideas in networks, and important breakthroughs come from multiple groups of people working and refining and sharing and borrowing and building on top of other people's platforms. What happens is, even though we have this concept in much of our culture, particularly in the United States, and I think partially here as well, that the market is the driver of innovation in society, it turns out that fourth quadrant has been responsible for as many, if not more, world-changing innovations, particularly over the last 200 years, exactly during the period of the dramatic rise of industrial and consumer capitalism. That open source space of the fourth quadrant has nonetheless actually kind of out-innovated the private sector during that time. In many cases, it's not a zero-sum game in the kind of the conflict between the open systems and the commercial systems. The internet is a great example. The internet is one of the great wealth creators of our time. And, countless numbers of very successful private ventures have been founded on this open platform that nobody owns. That is often the pattern that you see with these things. They create an open space, an open platform where commercial ventures can then set up shop and make a lot of money. So that fourth quadrant, I think, is an important corrective that we have to keep in our heads. It's not something that just happened with the web and with Wikipedia. It is, in fact, an old and kind of rich tradition that goes back many centuries, and it is an increasingly kind of vital part of where good ideas come from today. So what are some of the implications of this? What are some of the implications for intellectual property law? Let me talk about two of them. It's not that I think that there is no room for intellectual property, that we should abolish copyrights and patents, and everything should be open. I wouldn't go that far. What I believe is that, in a sense, the balance has shifted a little bit too far towards protecting and concealing as opposed to kind of opening things up. And I'll give you an example that's quite close to home. I sell books for a living, right? And my books are, they have copyrights on them. And there is some digital rights management that is built into the electronic versions of my books that keep you from just downloading them and creating some kind of book Napster, I suppose, is what the publisher's afraid is going to happen. And I'm fine with that. A reasonable level of kind of wrapper around things is I think, not inappropriate. But I think there also are limits. One of the things that is true of my books and just about any other kind of commercial new book out now on the Kindle or on the iPad and other competing formats is if you read them in an electronic form, and you really see this very strongly on the iPad, you cannot select the text and copy it. Right? You can select the text, and then there's sometimes a mechanism where you can then say highlight it. And then sometimes, very small number of circumstances, you can then get those highlights exported to a file or to a separate website where then you can go grab that text and copy it and paste it into your blog. But if you're sitting there reading a Kindle edition on an iPad and you select some text and then you go to copy that text, in a sense, it's like the text is covered with glass, right? You can't actually get to it, right? And presumably the idea is that the publishers are afraid that people will sit there and select paragraphs and stitch together an electronic version of my book, which then will create a book Napster, right? And maybe that is true, but it seems to me that this is really kind of a tragic waste of possibility here. Because the whole point of digital text is that you can do things with it. right? That you can borrow ideas and move them around and send them to friends and put them up on your blog and share and build off of other people's ideas. And at this point in time, I think, we've been around digital text enough that I think the ability to see text on a screen and select it and copy it is kind of an inalienable right of the digital age, right? It's, in some sense, it's not a feature when you keep people from being able to copy text and paste it into another application. It means that your software is broken on some basic level. Because one of the patterns that I talk about extensively in the book is this idea of the commonplace book, which is a great tradition of the Enlightenment, where scholars and thinkers would sit there and transcribe these passages from books that they found influential and stitch together these quotation books with their own notes included. And by reading through all these different notes, they would sit there and revisiting all these ideas that they borrowed and remixed from all these different minds. Their own intellectual sensibility would be born out of this kind of remixing of other voices on this kind of shared page that they would create. We have an incredible opportunity to build networked, social, digital age commonplace books now. We've got digital books, we've got the software, we've got an amazing global network of people who would be thrilled to be able to share ideas like that. And yet we're building these kind of artificial barricades to keep those ideas from going in motion. On the patent side, now obviously those of you who know anything about the history of intellectual property law, patents were originally invented in part to allow disclosure, right? To get the ideas out in motion. You were given a kind of restricted period where you kind of had ownership of your idea, but you had to disclose your invention to make sure that other people could see it. And so even there was this idea of getting ideas into circulation and getting them to flow. But I think what's happened is, again, the pendulum has switched too far, and we spend too much time kind of battling cease and desist orders from patent attorneys in startups and in other places. But there's a great example of something that I think gets it right very recently. And that is a collaboration between Nike and Creative Commons, which has done amazing work with kind of intellectual property law. And what Nike realized is that they have this corporate mandate to make more environmentally sustainable goods. That's part of their mission as a company. They want to be more green in what they produce. And they realize they're sitting on all this intellectual property in their labs, in their R&D labs, that's just hanging around there that might actually be useful to other companies working in non-competitive fields. So they come up with some great new material that's more environmentally sustainable for making kind of the rubber in a sneaker. And it might actually turn out to be useful to a tire manufacturer who could actually improve on it and teach Nike a thing or two about how to make this material even more environmentally sustainable or more efficient. Nike's not in the business of making tires. And so there's this cost, basically, that they're implicitly putting on all of us, on the society at large, by keeping that information, by keeping that idea locked up and kind of secretive in a vault somewhere. And so what they did is, with a couple of companies and with Creative Commons, they created this thing called the Green Exchange. And the Green Exchange is this open kind of marketplace for what had been kind of secret R&D, all of it thematically connected to environmental sustainability, where companies can kind of upload this information. And they've done two things. They created a kind of a one-click license for these things, where you can basically, you don't have to get a bunch of lawyers together to kind of license the technology. You can just check off and say, yes, I'm going to use it. So it's a lot easier just to kind of grab things and experiment with them. But here's the crucial thing. In that license, there's basically a kind of a non-competitive clause. It says, you are free to go and use these things in whatever you're doing, as long as it's not competitive with our core business. And so it's a system designed exactly to encourage that kind of borrowing across disciplines and across fields. It recognizes that innovation comes from something that was designed for sneakers that turns out to be amazingly good for auto tires. It's that porting over from one discipline to another that is such a kind of spark of innovation. And there you have intellectual property kind of wrappers that are designed to encourage that aren't designed to kind of keep that from happening, but actually are designed to facilitate that kind of creative borrowing. So I think that it's not that we want to do away with patents altogether, but we want to find more models like that and recognize that there is a lot of value to be had, and for Nike and for everyone else to be had in creating these new kinds of connection. Now, here's the funny thing. After writing this argument, defending the fourth quadrant, talking about open systems and open platforms and everything like that, I go out on book tour, and the second day of the book tour, I'm in Seattle at a wonderful event they have called Words and Wine, where everybody sits around and drinks wine all night, including the author, which is great. I'm a little bummed that you guys didn't provide that tonight. And in this format, there's an interviewer. And one of the things that happens on book tour is that you very quickly learn that all the questions that are asked of you are oftentimes, particularly from the interviewers, are very predictable because they're just reading from the list that the publicist has given them. They haven't even read the book, you know. But this night was different. We sat down, and my interviewer says to me, "Oh, Stephen, I've read the book, and I want to start things off by asking you a question I've been dying to ask you. Are you a communist?" I was like, "What? Oh, really? Was that the question?" So I took a long, very deep drink of my glass of wine. And he was joking, of course, but it was a very interesting question because the problem we have is that when you champion things like fourth quadrant environments, when you champion kind of open connection, the free flow of ideas, when you talk about the innovation that happens outside of the marketplace, there isn't a very easy political slot to put us. It is certainly not kind of traditional free market capitalism, right? We're talking about systems that exist outside the traditional incentives of the market and kind of financial reward. But it is certainly not communism, right? It's the furthest thing from kind of command and control planned economies, top-down kind of Stalinist systems, right? It's very much about decentralized networks where nobody's in charge, where there are kind of emergent connections forming. It's not about top-heavy states at all. And so the problem is right now, the growing number, and I know there are a number of people in the room who are in this world, the growing number of us who are really interested in what has happened in these spaces, all the possibility that's there being exploited but also still open for further exploitation in the fourth quadrant. We don't really have a very easy place on the traditional kind of left-right spectrum here. We're for decentralized systems, but not necessarily just for market forces. We're for the open flow of information for systems that everybody owns, but we're not for top-heavy states. And I think that one of the best examples of this is actually in a wonderful startup that started in New York just a year or two ago, which some of you may have heard. How many people have heard of Kickstarter? I think it's available here. It's a very interesting site. I encourage you to check it out, and it kind of embodies a lot of these principles. Kickstarter is a site that people use. They sometimes call it a kind of micro-patronage site. And Kickstarter basically is a way for people working on creative projects. They're finishing an album, they're working on a painting, or even they're doing some kind of social service that requires some kind of funding. And you can go to Kickstarter, list your project, and say, I need $2,000 to finish this album. If you contribute to it, I will take a kind of pledge for your money. If I get to $2,000 of pledges, I will then take your money from your credit card or wherever. And in return, you'll get something that the artist kind of defines. The artist doesn't have to promise anything, but oftentimes they say, you'll get invited to my CD launch party, or you will get a special signed print of this art that I'm working on, or I will send you a very nice letter, or I'll bake you a cake. Whatever it is, it can be anything. And sometimes it's nothing. And from this kind of free solicitation of support that has no kind of direct, normal kind of market incentives in it, right? The people contributing money are not getting, they're investing in these artists, but they're not investing to get a financial return. They're investing real capital for some kind of interesting social capital, for some feeling that they're supporting projects that are worthy, that they're interested in. That dynamic is just in about a year and a half of being in business, just as a little startup, they've already done $20 million worth of support for all these projects, and they're just getting started. Now, Kickstarter itself takes a small cut from each transaction. It is a for-profit business that is backed by very smart angel and venture investors and will probably make a very tidy return for its founders and for its investors. So what I'm trying to say to you is that Kickstarter is an example of precisely this kind of new openness, this sense of which there are kind of new models of how we collaborate, how we share our ideas, how we share resources, how we share capital, that in some cases involves new kinds of exchange. Some cases they're really old kinds of exchange that are kind of dressed up in new digital clothes. But they also are not necessarily opposed to the market. Kickstarter is a for-profit company, but it's enabling a kind of collaboration between people who want to support the arts and artists themselves that was very difficult to do before. But it's doing it entirely outside of the usual realm of kind of top-heavy government grants supporting artists. It's a decentralized network of support that is itself creating a kind of commercial model for the company that's facilitating it. And so what I would want to say to you now, particularly those of you who are thinking about the kind of economics of all of this in this context, is that we have a great opportunity right now for innovation in these kinds of models. The general category of financial innovation has been gotten a bad name in recent years for good reason. But I think when you look at things like Kickstarter and you look at platforms like that where you're seeing these kind of new models and these new experiments, it's amazing how many of them are kind of sprouting up and how quickly the audiences and people and consumers seem willing to adopt them. To say, hey, this is an entirely new model. I've never quite seen anything quite like that, but sure, I'll try it. So there's a willingness not only in terms of the startups generating new models, new ways of sharing ideas, new ways of supporting each other, but a willingness of all of us, of the consumers of these products, to get involved and to participate and to experiment them with those ideas. And so I think that the key thing that I would leave you with before we open it up to questions is that there is this kind of implicit innovation tax that we pay every time we invest all of our energies in kind of squirreling away our ideas and making sure nobody gets to them and spending all of our time protecting ideas. And that all of us need to spend more time. We have a great opportunity in front of us right now to figure out all the new kinds of value that we can get by trying to find new ways to connect our ideas instead. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Stephen. So can you guys hear me if I sit up straight? Okay. Do we have multiple mics floating around out there? Can I take some? Okay. So I guess the way we'll do this is, we have two? One? Two. So maybe I could just get a show of hands of who's got a question right now and decide on my strategy. Okay, 1, 2. All right. So why don't we start with you then, sir?
Hi. The first thing is an observation, which is your discussion of some kind of where on the political spectrum you put this devolved society.
Yeah.
I think in the UK we have the big society, which is a ostensibly right-wing idea of non-centralised devolving to the community to take responsibility for things. And I think intellectually, what you've described sounds like the big society for me. Not that I suspect anybody in or outside government really understands what the big society is. But my question is, you described your 4 quadrants, and as someone who's quite a believer in the kind of discovery power of incentives, when you put things in the 4 quadrants, there seems to me a distinction between having the idea and realising the value in it. And I think you can have definitely non-private sector firms having ideas. But the fact that you looked back 500 years and identified what ideas were good, I think maybe the private sector is quite good at identifying what ideas are good and what ideas are bad, if not having the good ideas. And I wonder how that fits into your theory.
Yeah, that's a very good point. This is a book, as the title says, about where good ideas come from. It is not focused on the clearly not on the kind of commercial application of good ideas and the process of taking something that is promising but needs to be refined and packaged and turned into something that is actually kind of directly useful. And that is often the way that things work, that the open environments create these interesting kind of sparks that allow for kind of new perspectives. And then the commercial sector comes in and says, okay, there's the building blocks here. I'm going to refine this, and then that's just a history again and again that you find. The oral contraceptive comes out of academic research, but then big pharma comes in and says, "Aha, yes, okay, we will make billions of dollars with this, and we need to refine it a little bit, and we need to figure out how to market it. We need to figure out what the kind of regulatory issues are." And so that's part of the point. I mean, Larry Lessig has this kind of concept of the hybrid economy. That the most useful kind of spaces are environments where you have kind of commons that are closely connected to commercial environments, where the two really collaborate in a useful way. And that's absolutely what I believe is the case. It's just that I do feel like that there is this bit of a sense of there's been a lot of discussion of open platforms and connectivity and open source and Wikipedia in recent years, but I think there's often a sense that that is this new thing that doesn't have this long history, and that it's sort of the kind of thing that only happens on the web. The web is this weird magic place where people will do things for the love of it. And that's not true. There is this very rich, long history that maybe is in fact older than kind of contemporary markets that we need to be reminded of. And so that book is an attempt to this book is an attempt to kind of nudge people to remind them that's there.
Okay. Other?
Somebody over there. No.
One here, and then take one over there.
Hello. I would like to ask about whether you see a distinction between how ideas come about in natural versus social sciences, and how, if there's a distinction, how do you qualify what is a good idea, and which stage you feel that happens?
What was the second part of the question?
Well, if there is a distinction in those two disciplines, then how do you qualify what is a good idea and what is not?
I don't know. I haven't actually really thought about it in that way. That's very interesting. I mean, there is the problem that the social sciences have, particularly when we're dealing with kind of macro tendencies in the social sciences, is it's hard to prove things, right? It's hard to run the kind of experiments, and that's one of the problems that I have, in a sense, writing as kind of a cultural critic about this question of how does society encourage ideas and how have ideas worked in the past. I built up that kind of fourth quadrant analysis in the end because the proof problem is tricky, right? You can't just go back and rewind the tape and do 12 different versions of it with different variables. And so you have to, in a sense, you really have kind of three different mechanisms at your disposal. You can do kind of long format analyses of a single case study and try and convince your audience that it's somehow representative of a larger truth. And in a way, that's what I've been trying to do with GhostMap and Invention of Air, that's the way in which they kind of complete the project. Then there's the argument by anecdote, but then there's somehow you look at a kind of statistical survey and try and figure out what the kind of the broad patterns are. But it's still very tricky, and it's inherently subjective. It's hard to say with a lot of these things which quadrant they should really be in. It's not as kind of precise as some other kinds of science. So I think that there is, in a sense, there's a bit more of an intuitive and a narrative form to the way that ideas form in the social sciences. And the problem is that you don't want to allow that to kind of discredit those insights, right? There may be cases where we will never be able to empirically prove certain insights about the world, but we're going to get as close as we can. And that kind of understanding is so important because we need to have that understanding of ourselves and how we interact. And so it's worth it to make the effort, even if we'll never get to the kind of the clarity of a real kind of proof. To some extent, that's similar in the natural sciences in the sense that, particularly in evolutionary environments, you can't rewind the tape and try it again and see what would have evolved. And so in guessing about the course of evolution, we have to kind of make similar inferences. But it's a really interesting question.
Hello. Isn't there a danger that with if everything turns into a sort of mashup of ideas because people are just stealing ideas from each other or borrowing ideas, if you like, from each other, is there a danger that we just become rather parasitic and don't become as creative as we could be?
Yeah, I think that can be the case. I mean, that's where the kind of diversity question is important, and the serendipity question becomes important. And this is the big active debate about the web right now, where there are some folks who think that the web is actually kind of narrowing our field of view because we can filter out everything we disagree with. And so because we have so much control over the kind of the flows of information in our lives, it creates this kind of echo chamber effect where we actually experience fewer and fewer kind of surprising, unlikely things. And that ends up making us less original in our thinking and less likely to stumble across some great new idea. I tend to feel that the web in general has had the opposite effect. And then in a sense, the link architecture of the web has made it, compared to things that have come before, much more likely to drive you out into kind of new discoveries. I mean, I think most of you have had the experience where you go onto Wikipedia for some reason, and then 3 hours later you're like, why am I reading about monarch butterflies? I had no idea that what happened? Where did my, you know, in a way, I mean, I feel like that the web is too serendipitous, sometimes where you're constantly just stumbling across crazy stuff that you weren't expecting to see. So I tend to believe that in a sense, the links are more powerful than the filters. I suppose you could get to a point where you have so much just kind of random intake that your ideas lose focus, and it's not that you get narrowed into an echo chamber kind of hole, but you're just this kind of primordial soup of ideas with no kind of clarity. And so there is a necessary kind of selection process to this, where you want to be able to say, okay, this thing I found and this thing I found, I need to put them together. This is interesting. And so and that's one place I think where social cues can be an interesting guide. I would say, more than half of my daily reading intake now comes to me from links that are being passed by people I follow on Twitter. And I've deliberately tried to cultivate an interesting, diverse group of people to follow. And my decision of what I'm going to read each morning over a kind of cup of coffee before I start work, while I'm procrastinating before I start work, is more and more selected by that eclectic group of people and less by the editorial board of the New York Times. In terms of what they put on the front page of the paper. And I find that is a great use of the technology, because I'm constantly getting passed along some interesting story that I never would have thought about, or I'm noticing that 6 of the people I follow all pointed to the same story. And the signaling implicit in that of like, wow, this is interesting, I got to follow that. There's something hot here, and it's not just a random kind of information overload kind of experience. I find that I get a lot out of those signals from my network.
One here. Yeah.
In the course of your research, can you think of an example, or did you come across an example, where this creative combination, or perhaps not creative combination of voices or minds, had actually slowed down or made a difficulty, rather than the benevolent effects you're mostly seeing? In other words, did you see it work the other way? Can you think of an example where it worked the other way?
Because there was a collaboration, it actually slowed it down. Interesting. No, there are no examples in the course of human history of that ever happening. Next question. No one has ever asked me that. I don't. You know, the limitations that I see, you know, part of the concept here is that because ideas are really kind of works of bricolage, where you're borrowing ideas and tools and technologies that are out there, one of the things that comes out of that theory is that there are certain ideas that are really heavily restricted by the context of their time. So it's not so much the actual collaboration, but kind of the thoughts available in other minds, or the technologies and tools available in other minds. It's actually quite amazing how few examples there are in history of truly ahead of their time ideas. People are just kind of amazingly, you know, when it becomes time to invent railroads, people start inventing railroads, but people don't try and invent railroads, with almost no exceptions, you know, 100 years before or 200 years before. And so there's amazing restriction in slowing down when you have one of those rare instances where an idea has leapt ahead of its kind of intellectual context, or the paradigm of research. Or the classic example of this is Babbage and inventing the programmable computer in 1835 and 1840 with the analytical engine. You know, he was trying to build a digital age computer with steam power, basically, and with industrial parts, and it just couldn't be done. And in fact, it failed so badly because that the ideas themselves, while he had actually kind of envisioned all the kind of major kind of core components of a computer, those ideas actually died out and had to be independently rediscovered 70 years later when people actually had vacuum tubes so they could start building real computers that actually worked. And so part of the trick is to make sure that you are working within the kind of the boundaries of possibility, both in terms of the people you're working with and the tools you're working with. And one of the reasons why Berners-Lee was able to invent the web there was kind of a rival idea to the web, for the web, which was this idea of Ted Nelson's, which was much more grandiose in its dream of a kind of global hypertext system. And it had wonderful things like, kind of some intellectual property built into it and some payment mechanisms built into it, had two-way linking, and all these very ambitious things, but it required that you build the whole thing from scratch, from start, And it was just too ambitious to actually make, whereas Berners-Lee was like, okay, I'm going to build on top of the existing internet platform, I'm going to borrow from the SGML standard here, I'm going to modify that, I'm not going to get it all done, but I'll get enough of it done and work within the space of possibility, and that was the one that actually got built and changed the world. Not quite the answer to your question, but I will find the case that somewhere it must be there. Do you know of one?
No, but I was wondering about, this isn't quite the sense in which I'm sorry, this is not quite the sense in which I asked the question, but I was just trying to think back to 19th century examples of very big ideas where I wasn't aware of a collective context. Darwin was actually the person that came to my mind. I'm not aware of crowdsourcing in Darwin's ideas, but this being the LSE, there's almost certainly a Darwin expert in the room who's going to contradict me any moment. But as far as I know, he worked mostly on his own, and I'm just setting it against your examples. I'm not arguing with your thesis at all. I just think it's interesting to look at where there are limitations or variations.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in some sense, Darwin did work alone, but he also was building, you can really see the clear kind of building blocks that enabled him to kind of think the thought. I mean, Lyell and the deep time of geology that was so important to him, and that some of his early insights that he kind of borrowed from those fields ended up being very useful in enabling him to solve this problem in the way that he was able to do.
Next question.
So we got
a couple here.
Hi, just wondering, drawing on your kind of previous experience as an entrepreneur,
right,
and some of the kind of examples of slow hunches and kind of the capital needs of some of these kind of slow hunches to actually become commercial entities. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of the lessons that the venture capital industry could kind of learn from some of your research to kind of reverse their recent fortunes.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, the last startup I did, Outside In, which is now doing quite well, came out of exactly this kind of collision. I was writing Ghost Map. I was writing about 19th century Victorian London and the neighborhoods and the maps of that. And at the same time, I was kind of procrastinating. This is a lot of theme about procrastination tonight. By reading local bloggers in my neighborhood in Brooklyn who were writing about kind of brownstone Brooklyn in this kind of new way. And then Google had just released its Maps API so you can develop on it. And the idea for Outside In, which is about hyperlocal news and a kind of platform for kind of people writing about their neighborhoods, came from the intersection of Victorian cholera, Google Maps API, and local bloggers. And it was because I was kind of interested in these seemingly different things that that idea kind of was there. But the truth is, we spent a very long time, we spent 2 or 3 years really trying to figure out what the real kind of plan was. I mean, there's a classic definition of a startup as a search algorithm for a business model, right? And part of what you need to be able to do, I think, is to obviously give your companies, when they're in that early stage, the opportunity to explore, and to not be so set on the kind of the core product at the beginning. The great thing about this time, if the VC is investing in kind of technology companies, particularly in web-based companies or mobile-based companies, the thing that makes that so much more financially reasonable now is that it takes so much less money to get through that alpha beta kind of phase, and so you can spend less than $2 million in 2 years, which in a traditional venture sense is a very small amount of money, working and experimenting, and you can just work with a team of 5 people and spend even less than that, and build products that can absolutely become huge, blow out. And so the kind of conventional venture idea of like, we need to be investing in something where they need $10 million up front because if we don't get $10 million to work, our fund won't be able to kind of return. That has to change. And I think a number of investors are realizing that they have to be able to invest like angels, invest small little seed amounts. And that's great because they can make these small bets, and if they don't pan out, if it turns out to be not that good an idea or the exploration process doesn't work out, they've only lost $500,000. And if it does work out, they're going to need $10 million because the idea is blowing up. Look how much Twitter has needed, to raise, even though it started as an idea basically where 3 or 4 people were working on it. So it's that kind of invest in a lot of things with seed level, angel level kind of money, but be ready with kind of deep pockets when one of those ideas breaks out.
Yeah, kind of along those lines. I was wondering what other examples or structures of linking the private for-profit sector with the open source sector you've seen or come across or you've come up with yourself. Because in my undergraduate university, they put a whole bunch of, not a whole bunch of, like 3 or 4 angel and venture capitalists on the hard scientists department board, and their patents and their research all went kind of through the roof over the next bunch of years. So if different ideas along those lines or things like that.
You know what? Where I'm really interested, it's slightly different space, but I think connected to this is the possibilities this opens up for the public sector of government agencies. And there have been a number of really interesting experiments here and in the U.S. Where you take something like a big government bureaucracy, which is generally historically very bad at innovating, and to use a phrase of Tim O'Reilly's, you see the government as a kind of software platform. That it has all this information, it has all these services, and all these things that it does, and it does quite well, but it does a terrible job of kind of sharing and marketing and getting word out about it and stuff like that. And on the outside of government, you have all these very smart people who have ideas about how to make government more useful and relevant to people's lives and to explain what it does and to share the information that it's sitting on and all this kind of stuff. And so if you open up government so that outside kind of developers and entrepreneurs can build on top of that data in useful ways, you can get a lot of innovation that is building on kind of the internal ideas of the government, but the kind of new ideas are coming from outside. So the classic example of this in DC, my hometown, which I can say is maybe the least innovative local government in the world, it certainly was when I was growing up, they did this kind of competition a few years ago that they originally called Hacking the District, but they decided that was not a very good name for it at all. And the premise was that they were sitting on all this information, so they released it. They created kind of an open API that people could kind of develop for. And they said, we're going to create a competition. And we're going to give $10,000 to the best app that somebody creates, either a web app or an iPhone app or an Android app. And it just has to use kind of our civic data in some interesting way that makes it useful for people living in the District of Columbia. And we'll give $10,000 to the winner and $5,000 to the runner-up. And they announced the competition, and in 2 months, they've got 47 apps. They spend almost no other money promoting this thing. By entering the competition, you have to agree to release your app freely into the world so that anybody can use it. So they have 47 working apps that every citizen of the District of Columbia can use. It ranges from very serious apps that show where your tax dollars are being kind of put to work to an app called Stumble Safely, which is a very useful app if you get too drunk in a bar in DC and you can't drive home. It will map the safest, based on crime reports, pedestrian route back to your house. Exactly the kind of thing that is very useful that city governments traditionally have not produced in the past, right? And so they estimated if they had done this through the normal kind of government channels of, we are going to create an initiative to create apps for the city, it would have taken them $2 million, cost them $2 million and taken 2 years, and they would have gotten 5 apps, right? But because they said, hey, go ahead, go crazy, because people, this is a great space where people have all these ideas, they have spare time, they have hobbies, they have all this expertise, and they will sometimes just do things for the love of it, but if it involves their society, if it involves their town, they will really care, and they're really invested in it. They have this kind of emotional and kind of personal stake in making this information more available. And so I think that's a really interesting model. In fact, the guy who did it, the CTO of the District of Columbia, when they did it the next year, he wasn't around because he's now the Chief Information Officer of the United States of America in the Obama administration. So, and on a federal level, they've been doing a lot of things like that. And I don't even want to talk about American politics right now, but I'm trying not to look at my phone. But it's a very sorry story over there. But anyway, so I think that's a pretty interesting model as well.
We probably have time for about one more question. There was a woman over here. Yeah.
I wanted to know how good ideas evolve, right? So you start with a good idea, and then from the point when it's an idea to when it's realized, I guess in your research, did you see a lot of evolution from it being a good idea to, I guess, sort of how it evolved? A lot of changes from the original idea to where
that's part of the kind of core notion of the slow hunch that I alluded to, that you see again and again these things where the ideas start as they're promising, but you really don't know why they're all that promising. You just have this kind of itch in a sense. There's something interesting about this problem that you're drawn towards. I mean, I'll bring back to it. Tim Berners-Lee started working on the project that would become the web in the early 1980s as just a side project at the Swiss physics lab that he was working at, just to organize the local data of the lab. There were a lot of people, a lot of projects going around, and so he created this little software program just as a hobby at work. And then he kind of messed around with it. Called it Inquire. Then he did a version called Tangle. And then it slowly started to build in his kind of scope for it, his ambition for it. And then he finally did a version called the Web, where he brought over some of these existing other standards and kind of widened it. And it wasn't until then that he even told his bosses about it, which I love. You know, he's kind of like, oh, by the way, I may have invented a new medium. Can this be my job now? You know, and one of the principles actually, which I should mention, that particularly in this context is, you know, organizationally, how do you carve out the space for your employees to have these kinds of hunches? It's very hard to go to your boss and say, I have a good idea, I'm not sure what it is, I think it will be relevant to our business circa 2017, if that's all right. You know, can I work on it? You know, but there are these interesting techniques. I'm sure people have talked about them here and studied them. Things like innovation time off that Google does, where you're given kind of 20% of your time to work basically on whatever you want, to work on your hobbies. They just have to be relevant vaguely to the corporate mission, but with Google, the corporate mission is organizing all the world's information, so pretty much anything, you know. I'm organizing my Lego collection. But they actually get something like 50% of their kind of shipping, you know, features and products, new innovations, out of the 20% time of their employees, because it is, in a sense, this kind of slow hunch cultivating process that's there that allows these ideas to start with some interesting little inkling of something and really then blossom over time into something much bigger.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have for tonight, but Stephen will be sending his book outside. Stephen, I wonder if you would indulge me in a question of my own.
Yes.
Could you leave us with one tip for us as individuals in terms of how to come up with better ideas?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a very simple thing, actually, which is important, which is, and I have a bunch of kind of techniques that I've used over the years, which I tried not to write about too much in the book, because it's a book about great ideas, and you don't want to be like, and another technique that I use for my great ideas. Nobody wants to be that guy, but since you've asked. So one of the things that I do, it sounds very obvious, but I have a single document that I use where I have now been keeping it for 6 years, where I write down every little hunch, and it's like, this is a book idea, this is an article idea, a speech idea, a startup idea, someone I should call idea. And I keep them all in one place. I don't try and classify it, I don't try and put it into folders, because the danger of putting something into a separate folder or a separate little silo is it gets lost or it gets orphaned there. And I've been keeping that one. Originally it was a Word document, now it's a Google Doc, so I can get to it pretty much from anywhere now. But here's the key thing. I go back and I reread that whole document every kind of 3 months. And it's one of the things that's rewarding about it is that you see these little kind of hunches, you're like, hey, and a whole book came out of that. You know, that was a good one. But more often than not, you find these kind of orphaned ideas that you thought, this little fragment of something you thought in 2006, which made no sense in 2006. But that actually in 2010, because of someone you've met or because of some new technology or some new partnership you have or just your own development, turns out to be really interesting in 2010. And so it's, in a sense, what that enables you to do is to kind of network with your own ideas, right? Your own kind of past ideas. Because it's amazing, particularly with things that are kind of fragments, it's amazing how much you forget. You will just forget everything if you don't write it down and then revisit it. So just like you're doing, write it down right there and then go back and revisit it. So that's something that has worked for me.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, it's
Thank
been a real
you all.
pleasure.